Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. My name is Gregory Ormsby-Mori, the Outreach Coordinator with the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. There may be an echo just now with my mic. I apologize for that. Today's presentation with Dennis Garrity, creating an evergreen agriculture for a land degradation neutral world. Dennis, you might, while I'm speaking, maybe mute your speaker a bit there, if that's possible, and I'll cue you to come back in because it is creating an echo.
Okay. I'm not sure how I do that, actually.
Yeah, don't sweat it.
Okay.
Don't sweat it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just make the intro brief then. So the Agroforestry in Action webinar series is held approximately monthly. And again, this week's presentation with Dennis Garrity, creating an evergreen agriculture. Dennis Garrity is a systems agronomist and research leader whose career has been focused on the development of small-scale farming systems in the tropics. He is currently Drylands Ambassador for the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. He's a distinguished research fellow at the World Agroforestry Center, and prior to that, served as a Director General of the Center from 2001 to 2011. He's currently leading the Evergreen Agriculture Partnership. Dennis Garrity also chairs the steering committee for Land Care International, a worldwide effort to support grassroots, community-based natural resource management. During the 1990s, he was based in Indonesia, where he launched and developed the Southeast Asia Regional Program as head of Farming Systems Program at the International Rice Research Institute and as a professor at the University of the Philippines in the 1990s. He advised many masters and doctoral and postdoctoral fellows from all over the world. He's published many articles and books. He studied in the United States for his bachelor's and master's at the master's in the University of the Philippines in Los Baños. He did his PhD in crop physiology from the University of Nebraska. Our presentation today will run about 45 minutes, after which there'll be about 10 or 15 minutes for question and answers. So I'll now turn it over to Dennis to begin. Dennis? Just a minute while he unmutes his mic.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Greg. You're hearing me okay?
Very good. And I'm going to mute my mic now.
Please take it forward.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Greg, for the introduction, and extra thanks for your warm invitation to connect with the group in this event. And jumbo to everyone from Nairobi, and thanks to all of you who've patched in today. I see we have even participants from as far away as France, probably elsewhere as well, outside the US. Well, my objective is to take you all on a little journey, or more accurately, to share with you a bit about a journey that I and many of my colleagues at the World Agroforestry Center have been engaged in for several years now. It's actually a journey that started when I was Director General at the center and have continued to pursue since I retired from that position 4 years ago. I was trained as an agronomist, actually, and it was from that perspective that I came into agroforestry about 30 years ago. And then, as now, agroforestry, although a field that basically sees trees as part of agricultural systems, was pretty much ignored by the hardcore agricultural science and practitioner community. And that disturbed me, particularly since I come from the agronomic sciences. It disturbed me that this situation was basically not changing after all these years. And I wondered what was wrong and how we could better relate to that powerful and influential community. I decided that it was probably partly a matter of branding, of what we do and partly a matter of building a much better and more coherent evidence base that would attract their serious attention. So this is what led us to the concept of evergreen agriculture as a way to emphasize the opportunities for integrating trees directly into cropping systems. Evergreen agriculture actually is a term that derives its origins from Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, who many of you may know was the father of the Green Revolution in India and a long-term mentor of mine, who has been arguing for 30 years that what we need is an evergreen revolution to make farming more ecologically sustainable. And so we started from that vantage point and basically defined evergreen agriculture as a form of more agroecologically intensive farming that integrates trees directly into crop and livestock production systems. Not around the edges, but into the systems themselves. And at least here in the tropics, evergreen farming systems are seen as double-story systems that feature both perennial and annual species, maintaining a green cover on the land throughout the year. That, of course, is not particularly the case in the temperate zones, but certainly the double-story aspect is quite relevant. Now, where do we place evergreen agriculture within the universe of agroforestry? Well, here we have a list of what are considered to be major types of agroforestry. We have the agroforests, which are combinations of perennial species, basically fully covering the land, but mixed combinations, and not including annual crops. We have the home gardens with perennials, which are a huge environment in the tropics. We have woodlots or farm forestry. We have trees on field and farm boundaries. We have the vast silvopastoral systems, trees in various kinds of rangeland and pastures. And then we have what we now call evergreen agriculture, which has been traditionally considered the intercropping of trees with field crops, or tree crop intercropping. A title that isn't very exciting or evocative. And that, of course, includes the variant called alley cropping as well. So this is where the branding of evergreen agriculture basically corresponds to our concept of tree crop intercropping that we've known and worked with for many, many years. But it's the one that we zero in on here because it's the one, as I mentioned, that is most dubious to the hardcore agricultural community. The fact that you're putting trees into crop fields directly is the most dubious concept to many people in the crop and soils sciences. Now, when we look at what we include within evergreen agriculture, I already mentioned the interplanting of trees, which in mechanized systems is basically manifested as alley cropping systems. But we find in the tropics, there are two major movements that are gaining a great deal of momentum that we also consider very important aspects of evergreen agriculture. One of these is farmer-managed natural regeneration of trees on croplands, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then conservation agriculture, or minimum tillage practices, in which trees are a major part of the system. And this is where we're working with the conservation agriculture community to actually make the case that it is, in fact, the inclusion of trees that helps to overcome many of the major constraints to adoption and the practice of conservation agriculture within the tropical situation in particular. So as we go into what we're actually doing in evergreen agriculture. First of all, I wanted to basically give you a little bit of background on the story of what has been an extremely inspiring evolution that has occurred in the drylands of Africa. And here we are in the sorghum and millet farming systems that are typical of the Sahelian zone in the northern part of the continent, just south of the Sahara Desert. And we're talking about a massive renaissance of tree regeneration on the croplands in that zone. And in particular, I'd like to focus us on what is happening in Niger, which actually is one of the poorest countries in the world, but in which over 1 million farm households have participated in this transformation that is probably the most widespread, contiguous environmental transformation we have ever seen in Africa. Now, if you're flying over southern Niger nowadays, this is what you see. All of the land in this photograph is farmland, with villages interspersed. The darker spots are villages which have neem trees growing in them. But all the area in between the villages where sorghum and millet are emerging, this is early in the growing season, are covered by a carpet of native regenerated species of trees. And in this case, the landscape is dominated mostly by Phytherbia albita, or the species we've known previously as Acacia albita, an amazing tree which exhibits a phenology that has been recognized by farmers in Africa as extremely compatible with farming systems. And that compatibility is really represented by this sort of a situation where on the ground, the Phytherbia tree is dormant during the growing season. It has dropped all of its leaves at the beginning of the rains. And by the way, it's a nitrogen fixing species. And so it's got a highly nutritious biomass for soil fertility. And farmers observed that in the vicinity of these trees, you get an enormous increase in the crop growth and yield performance. And that traditional knowledge has been known by farmers, but not appreciated much by agricultural science, and certainly not by extension, while farmers have themselves been doing it in many parts of the continent. The species is native to Africa, but is not resident outside of the continent, except where it's been introduced, such as in India, where it's performing very well. Now, I mentioned the microclimate buffering effect, and this is particularly relevant to our concerns about how to buffer the growth of crops as temperatures increase due to global warming. And in our work with our colleagues from CIMMYT, working with both wheat and maize systems, they have become very excited about the fact that the midday canopy temperatures of crops like wheat and maize are oftentimes buffered quite substantially by the presence of the trees in the fields, both due to reduction in wind speed and reduction in an increase in vapor pressure in the canopy. And so you have this potential greenhouse effect of reducing the stress, the crop stress that's experienced in midday temperature regimes. And this is particularly interesting and worrying at the present time because in the Sahel, the temperatures have increased about 1 degree centigrade on average in the past 30 years. Whoops. So in summary, over 5 million hectares of land have been restored with the establishment of over 200 million of these trees They were not planted, but they were selected and regenerated from seedlings that emerged from the soil in the context of farming in this environment. And livestock spread the seed around the environment, so there's ample quantities of seed that are there in the soil for regeneration. And because of its demonstrated effect on increasing crop yields, those farmers have been experiencing additional grain yields, particularly during drought spells, and a very substantial increase in soil carbon. Farmers market the fuel wood, the timber of the trees, and honey production is excellent from these trees as well. So there's a multi bundle of benefits that farmers see in actually managing these trees as an integral part of their farming system. And so the practice is now being encouraged by a whole range of projects. And we've gotten this momentum going during just the last 5 or 6 years, where projects now are helping to develop farmer-to-farmer extension to spread the process out from core areas, green spots, where it has been developed and adopted, and it looks to be spreading across the entire Sahel over the coming decade or two. And this is very, very encouraging because of the recognized benefits, and the scaling up process is now giving more and more of the agriculturists confidence that it makes sense for, in many respects, for farmers to actually do this practice. And from the livestock perspective, it's especially important because during the late dry season, when livestock is often starving in the Sahelian zone, these trees are actually pruned for their highly nutritious leaf matter and pods, which are of the quality of soybean pods for forage during that critical time of late season drought in the dry season, when the trees themselves have fully foliated and are growing when the crops are not in the field. But that's not the whole story. We are now gathering evidence from the evolution of these systems all over the continent. Recently, we published a paper indicating there's about 1 million farmers in Ethiopia that have been regenerating Phythermia albita trees on their farmland. And we've just completed a major study in Malawi, where we've been observing over the past 5 to 10 years a resurgence of farmer interest in farmer-managed natural regeneration, and have mapped the process so that we have demonstrated to ourselves and others that it's ubiquitous across the maize-growing areas of the subhumid maize production systems of Malawi. And so it is a practice that is clearly being demonstrated as of widespread significance in a range of different farming systems in Africa. That has been taken note of by the African Union, actually, and a little over a year ago, we recommended and had accepted by the African Union a new target whereby the African Union intends to enable every farm family and every village across the drylands of Africa to be practicing farmer-managed natural regeneration over the next 10 years. Now, that sounds like an awfully big goal to chew on, but actually, considering the fact that there are no cash costs involved in actually selecting seedlings of trees and managing their density, pruning them as necessary, you can in fact establish these systems with zero cash inputs, which of course is a highly unusual type of technology to be practicing in farming systems where most technologies cost something and therefore are out of the range of probability for most farm families. But this one is unique in that respect. And recently we've had a major study done by the World Bank, which has looked into the economics of this on a detailed scale, and has shown that compared to virtually any other practice in the drylands and some humid areas of Africa where the vast amount of crop production is done, the benefit cost ratio is enormously more favorable. And the bank itself has now gotten very, very interested and is initiating all sorts of work to invest in the extension of this practice. So this is now, there we go. This has now really gained a tremendous amount of momentum at both the political and policy level, continentally and within many countries. And we're looking to develop an Africa Union-sponsored platform to be able to coordinate and promote the development of these systems at an even much greater momentum. I mentioned earlier conservation agriculture with trees. And this photo shows an example of the technology as applied in Zambia, which is a major maize producer in southern Africa, and how the Phythervia trees are managed in fully mechanized minimum tillage or zero tillage systems with commercial maize production. And in this case, the government of Zambia and the Conservation Farming Unit are extending this technology to hundreds of thousands of farmers, whereby the trees are recommended to be planted in a 10 by 10 meter grid pattern in the field, where mechanization is practiced in the interspaces between the trees. And that practice is based on some very, very promising results that they have been conducting countrywide in terms of farmer field trials, where the production of maize, the yield of maize, has been compared between situations with Phythervia trees, as in the previous slide, and without Phythervia. And in the case of Zambia, where only a minority of farmers, like in most countries, actually apply fertilizer, can afford to apply fertilizer, or find it profitable enough to apply fertilizer, you have a situation where the presence of the Phythervia trees has a tendency to double, or even in some cases triple, the yield of maize in these systems. When you apply fertilizer as well, you get an additional effect. Now, for the smaller scale farmers, the 1 hectare type of farmers, which is extremely common in African farming systems nowadays, there are numerous other types of these fertilizer tree systems that are being promoted. This is back to Malawi, where Garrity sepium has become a major component of the farming systems in many districts, where farmers plant the trees at high density in a grid pattern, not in this case in alleys, but a grid pattern throughout the field within 1.5 to 2 meters, and grow their maize crops in between while using the Garrity as a fertilizer and a fodder for their livestock. And indeed, again, we see an enormous potential for these systems to build up soil carbon, build up soil nitrogen, and to create a sustainably higher yield on the order of double or triple or even quadruple the yields that farmers normally obtain. And again, very few farmers buy fertilizer in a country like Malawi. So we're seeing an opportunity here to help farmers who are at the very edge and unable to put in adequate amounts of cash inputs into a system, but to be able to use a biological approach to really improving their soil fertility. And indeed, we've done surveys of farmers that are using these practices throughout Malawi and find that the yields under farmer management are also improved quite significantly. So what we're looking at in terms of evergreen agriculture in smallholder farming systems in the tropics is designing or redesigning annual crop systems to accommodate individual species of fertilizer trees or combinations of them. And given the examples I've just shown, the Gliricidia trees tend to be planted quite densely in a field, whereas the Phyteherbia trees are at a wider spacing. One of the species, Gliricidia, is managed as a bush and it's pruned intensively, but it's a heavy biomass producer, while the Phyteherbia trees are full canopy trees that naturally disperse their biomass at the beginning of the wet season. So you can mix and match these systems, and that's exactly what's being done in countries like Malawi, where both systems are being practiced. Now that has really gotten a lot of our colleagues in the Eastern and Southern African countries quite interested in how they can begin to link the upscaling of agroforestry of this type of fertilizer tree systems along with their major input subsidy programs. And billions of dollars are being invested currently in the provision of subsidized fertilizer to farmers, particularly urea. And what has happened is that we were asked to share these results with the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, which includes 21 countries. And the ministers just recently approved the development of a facility to assist countries to develop the capability to scale up fertilizer trees in their input subsidy programs. And so the agroforestry technologies would be directly included into the input subsidies, and farmers would get the technology for the trees along with the subsidized fertilizer. We've had test programs on this in Malawi for a number of years, and now this new facility will enable the building of capacity in countries like Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya, etc., who are interested in making that linkage as well. And I find that a very exciting development. So, we are now looking at a situation where many countries, and particularly those countries in the subhumid and semi-arid environments, are beginning to develop their own national programs in evergreen agriculture, and many of the farming systems. I understand that the audio has dropped. Is that correct?
Seemed to have dropped for a minute. I think it was just down for a minute. So let's maybe resume at the beginning, redo this slide.
Okay. Okay, great. I was just saying that now quite a number of countries are engaging in the development of evergreen agriculture scaling up programs. And these include the participation of many of the international NGOs that are building their capacity to do evergreen agriculture scaling as well. These NGOs such as Catholic Relief Services, CARE, World Vision, and others. And so a major part of our work now is building their capacity to do this and to build the capacity of government extension systems. Well, what's the situation in the temperate areas? All of us recognize that in the temperate zone, with a shorter growing season and a long cold period, the direct integration of trees into cropping systems presents unique challenges. And of course, the evolution of large-scale commercial mechanization also brings in challenges for the inclusion of trees. And I must admit that the last place that I had ever thought we would see the development of evergreen agriculture type systems was in the Corn Belt of the United States. However, to my great shock and satisfaction, that is in fact happening. And as some of you may be aware, under the leadership of Mark Shepard, who was a farmer in southern Wisconsin, we have seen the evolution of a theory and practice in fully commercialized farming systems of development of these kind of systems. And Mark calls these restoration agriculture because he has developed the systems around the concept of creating a mimic or an analog of the natural ecology of the Corn Belt areas. And this ecology really revolves around the original oak savanna grassland systems. And his concept is an alley cropping concept that embeds the kinds of trees that provide structure and function to the system that are analogous to the oak savannas that were originally present in these systems. And he's looked at this in other types of farming systems in the United States as well. And I understand that now this successful development of these systems has created the impetus for a lot of research being initiated in Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, etc. And I begin to see that both the theory and the practice that Mark has evolved here creates a momentum towards introducing the practicality of actually developing highly commercialized, large-scale alley cropping systems based on a good ecological theory. So this has been very, very exciting, and we're working quite closely with Mark in this endeavor these days. Oh boy. Let's see here. Okay, so we see, in fact, through Mark's work, the development of systems based on cash crop, multi-story situations with full canopy trees as well as intermediate-sized trees and ground level layers as well, from your oaks to your hazelnut in the understory to raspberries and other types of more low-growing species. So Mark has been working on these systems for a number of years and has been developing them through commercial channels with his neighbors and the organic farming movement in that area, and it's become a major economic enterprise. Mark emphasizes that alley cropping is, of course, known in U.S. circles as a agroforestry practice, but it's probably been, compared to windbreaks and boundary planting and others, the least developed of the agroforestry practices in temperate U.S., and he's thinking that this is exactly where we ought to be focusing more attention. And here's a shot on his farm of harvesting annual crops with walnut as the alleyway. Now, I could show you also similar pictures from Europe, where there has been a tremendous renaissance of agroforestry research and development, particularly led by colleagues in France, who are developing similar types of alley cropping systems and have been particularly successful in integrating these practices into policy of the common agricultural policy in Europe, which is beginning to make major inroads into the subsidization of farmers to get engaged in agroforestry. And as I say, France has been a leading country in the development of these systems for the European context. Well, what we are engaging in currently is the development of a global partnership to try to pull together the communities that are engaged and could be engaged in the further development of this movement through its scientific aspects, educational aspects, and the scaling up of these practices in evergreen agriculture. And these are the various communities that we're engaged with cultivating to build momentum around the concepts that we're talking about in evergreen agriculture. Now, let's see if we are looking at cultivating each of the individual communities and looking towards their role in terms of advancing the context of evergreen agriculture. And that is what we're really putting a lot of emphasis on now, right, is creating coherence and cohesion in these communities so that there is mutual support for the development of all of these aspects of evergreen agriculture context. Now, I'd like to turn our attention as I begin to close here with the situation as we link evergreen agriculture and agroforestry in general to the global context. And there is now, over the past couple of years, a tremendous amount of momentum built up at the global level, recognizing the enormous challenge of creating, of restoring land for agriculture, forestry, and rangeland because of the trends that we're noticing, very alarming trends in degradation of these systems. And the red that you see on this map indicates a negative trend in net primary productivity, which is an index of a land degradation process in train. And so what's happened is that recently the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, has included a target for zero net land degradation by 2030 to highlight and emphasize the need for a global focus on restoring our land resources. Zero net land degradation is perhaps not a really simple concept until you look at it in its components. And basically, by those mapping processes and definitions, we look at land that is degrading, land that is regenerating, and land that is stable in terms of its vegetative cover, soil carbon, and productivity for human uses. And basically, a land degradation neutral situation at the country level or a global level is aiming for a target that exceeds the ratio of 1, where regenerating land is increasing faster than degradation elsewhere. And in fact, working with the World Resources Institute, we've identified that there is, in fact, a world of opportunity for forest and landscape restoration. And this map covers a total area of about 2 billion hectares of land which could be further restored in degraded forests, agriculture, and rangeland through the practice of restoration. And restoration here is considered in the broad sense, encompassing all of these sectors. Certainly, the time is urgent for this to be approached in Africa, where large parts of the continent are now mapped as trending downwards in terms of land degradation. That is the red that you see on this map, large areas in Central and Southern Africa, largely due to land clearance and the degradation of productive systems. And so, over the last few years, the global community has gotten together and in 2011 basically laid out what is known as the Bond Challenge to restore 150 million hectares of land by the year 2020, or have them under restoration. And then last year at the New York Climate Summit, that target was extended to 350 million hectares under restoration by 2030. And so this momentum is beginning to now create a situation where, through voluntary but formal commitments, many countries have designated areas toward these targets. The United States has 15 million hectares, for example. Ethiopia has committed 15 million hectares. Kenya is going to be making its commitment during the Paris Climate Summit of probably about 10 million hectares, and so on. And what this is looking at is a landscape approach. Wide-scale restoration opportunities in the degraded primary forest and secondary forest, and then in the agricultural areas, a mosaic of restoration opportunities. And what's been very interesting, I think, from an agroforestry point of view, is that our restoration community has come back to us and said, you know, we're actually seeing that agroforestry in general and evergreen agriculture in particular will be one of the most important parts of the total restoration program globally. And in fact, may be the greatest area coverage in the long run. And so we're actually conceiving that when we go from a situation as we have now to what we would like to see in the future, the evolution in each of the sectors of land use change, we're looking at agriculture becoming climate smart agriculture. We're looking at forest land being regenerated, particularly through assisted natural regeneration. And we're looking at the approach to degraded or underutilized land as moving particularly into agroforestry systems. And with this conceptual framework, we're finding a tremendously greater traction for the role of agroforestry in these kinds of systems. And that has been very exciting to witness. In fact, just recently, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which includes about 200 of the biggest corporations in the world, has set up an intention to restore at least 12 million hectares of degraded land per year, which would be a tremendous contribution to these global challenges. Well, let me wind down by saying, sharing a couple of quotes from Monique Barbu, who is the executive secretary for the UN Convention on Combating Desertification. And she noted recently that all but 4 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are directly linked to the use of the land. And she said that it will require bold action to turn from the current land use practices and to restore more degraded land for our use. We therefore need to adopt land use practices that are sustainable and to restore more of the degraded land to meet our future growth. And she pointed out that a lot of these agricultural practices are already well known and surprisingly cheap. And she particularly noted no-till agriculture, evergreen agriculture, agroforestry in general, farmer-managed natural regeneration, and holistic management of rangelands, and many more. But she said that they are underutilized because we have not mustered the courage to make them competitive through incentives that stimulate their adoption. And she recently released an op-ed that indicated that, as we know now, the country's commitments under the climate change to their intended nationally determined commitments to reducing greenhouse gases are not going to be adequate to reach the 2-degree limit for catastrophic climate change, and said that their analysis are now showing that the restoration of land, and certainly largely due to agroforestry, is the key to actually closing that gap between what countries are currently committed to doing and what needs to be done. And there again brings agroforestry into the center stage of the development and accomplishment or achievement of the climate change aspirations globally. Very, very interesting. Well, Greg, I'll just close by saying that it's been a great pleasure to be able to share some of these ideas with you, and I'd like to invite those engaged here in this event to join us on this journey, and that I think that you will find much more about the field of evergreen agriculture on the Evergreen Agriculture website. And we are, in fact, launching a newsletter on creating an evergreen world during the next couple of weeks. And we hope to keep the community that's developing around this much better informed about all the developments. So if you would like to be on the mailing list for the newsletter, you could just send me an email, and we'll get you connected. And we ourselves would very much like to hear from you about your work and about your interests that may connect with this growing global movement. And perhaps we may even be able to collaborate in the future. Well, let me turn back the mic to you, Greg, to open up the question and answer segment.
Well, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you. I am opening now a Q&A box. I don't know if you've noticed, there's been a rather robust discussion going on in the chat box. Unfortunately, there's a bit of echo with both of the microphones, but participants, if you see, there is a Q&A box there. You should see a dialogue box at the bottom of the Q&A box. While some are submitting their initial questions, I will refer back to questions that were submitted at the beginning of the presentation. For example, Gabriel Harris had asked about the carbon sequestration potential in the evergreen agricultural system, specifically when you were looking at the Phyteria albita system and the reverse phenology and with the maize grown underneath. She'd ask about carbon sequestration potential in that system.
That's an excellent question, and of course the sequestration will vary from place to place. Under the more subhumid conditions, we see about 1/2 to 1 ton per hectare sequestration per year annually. In the drier areas, such as in Niger, with only 400 to 500 millimeters of rain per year, sequestration is more on the area of 1/2 ton per hectare. The thing I would point out, and that I like to mention often when we talk about sequestration in agriculture, is that most of the data and experiences in conservation tillage, minimum tillage, zero tillage, result in carbon accumulation in the soil of no more than slightly above zero to maybe 2.2 tons per hectare. And therefore, the inclusion of trees or shrubs into these systems, as we're talking here, really massively increases the sequestration potential of these systems. And we're going to talk a lot about this in Paris in a couple of weeks, because the French government is taking a tremendous and very welcome leadership role in developing a new program, an international program to expand carbon sequestration in soils and landscapes throughout the world. It's called 4 pour mille, or 4 1,000ths, based on the concept that the world is capable of sequestering an additional 4 kilograms of carbon per hectare per year on top of the current carbon stocks, or 4/1000ths of a percent of carbon increase per hectare per year. And this looks like a very, very interesting way to focus attention on the important role of agriculture in carbon sequestration in the future, to close that gap I was talking about.
Very good. Thank you, Dennis. I'm not seeing any other questions come in on the Q&A box. Oh, here comes one there. But while they're coming in, I will mention to the participants that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our website for future viewing. But Dennis, Jeff Gleim asks, don't the trees compete with the crops for water and nutrients?
Well, this is the observation that, of course, has been the stumbling block for years and years with agricultural scientists, because obviously people are very much aware of how competitive trees can be with crops if not selected properly and managed properly. And in the situations that we're talking about, there are various ways in which farmers, in fact, manage those trees. The density of the trees is the first starting. The species that's used, the way in which trees are pruned, and we are finding that pruning strategies are very, very flexible for minimizing, if not eliminating, the actual competition of the trees for light, nutrients, and water. And so those are the key variables that you have to work with. And a lot of work needs to be done under local conditions all over the world to actually develop suitable systems that, based on the kind of principles we've seen where it's been very successful, can be adapted.
Thank you, Dennis. Moving on, I'm going to perhaps limit my comments because I think there's an echo with my microphone and your speakers. So, Dennis, you noticed the 2 questions by Neil Spackman about whether any studies that would document this kind of restoration agriculture and reforestation and the Garrity albita systems in Niger.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any documentation of that resulting in greater rainfall? And you see his next question on evapotranspiration.
That's very, very interesting. Actually, this work has stimulated some very interesting modeling and interpretation that has been coming up over the last couple of years. And what I can say in terms of rainfall is that it's clear now and well scientifically documented that areas that have more tree vegetation do in fact create greater amounts of rainfall downwind of the areas that are under the trees. And so what you can expect most anywhere in the world is that higher densities of tree cover, which creates more evapotranspiration, naturally loads the atmosphere with more water vapor, but that that rainfall is going to be actually dispersed downwind, and that may be hundreds of kilometers downwind from the area where the trees were actually occurring. And so there is now a lot more confidence that the old saw about trees generating rainfall is actually true, but it's not true for the area where the trees are located, but the area downwind of your trees is going to be experiencing more favorable rainfall conditions. And there's a whole session coming up on the subject in Paris in a couple of weeks, where scientists are going to be presenting a lot of the new data along these lines.
Good. Thank you, Dennis. I'd like to turn your attention to another question by Eric Volsky in both the chats and the question box. Well, we have here at the University of Missouri, our Center for Agroforestry and our research have had quite a bit of research in the past looking at the potential for root pruning and impact on some of the competition dynamics. Dennis, can you comment on is there any use of root pruning in some of these systems, and have you observed any potential or any impacts from that?
Well, we have covered, the issue of above ground pruning, and just would mention there that above ground pruning that shapes the tree as an inverted vase, where you're pruning to the trunk at lower elevations, and then allowing the tree to grow up more spreading at higher elevation, gives you more sunlight penetration at different times of the day. So there are ways of pruning the trees to be able to do that. Some farmers just simply prune the trees completely during the cropping season and use the leaves for fodder and fuel wood. So that of course eliminates the competition entirely. But for root pruning, of course, root pruning is a difficult thing to do other than at the very surface layer, down to 20 centimeters or so. And what we find is that, of course, in cropping systems where tillage is being practiced, that natural root pruning occurs and the tree roots are directed into deeper layers. But it's really interesting to find that and it's so counterintuitive that in very dry areas, 400 millimeters, with the right species, you're finding that farmers are finding that their soil moisture conditions are dramatically improved, and even water tables are increased due to the higher infiltration of water in the soils because of less runoff from the fields when you are producing crops under these phytoherbious systems. So indeed, root pruning is a factor, but of course, doing it agronomically is difficult. So what you want to do is get the right species and direct the root systems downward.
Maybe one last final question or topic of discussion. If you notice the comments from John Paul Learn, he's asking about the importance of cooperatives or grower and farmer associations to the success of these systems and perhaps their promotion in more widespread adoption. Could you comment on that, Dennis? The role of cooperatives and growers associations?
Well, I'm sure that Mark Shepard could really wax poetic on this topic because indeed he's not only a very strong proponent of cooperatives as a key way of moving this agenda forward at the local level, but has been instrumental in developing massive cooperatives like Organic Valley, which is now $1 billion a year cooperative enterprise that started off a couple of decades ago with him and colleagues. So cooperatives play a very, very important role, both in terms of reinforcing the marketing of the variety of products that are going to be produced in agroforestry systems, the processing or pre-processing of those products, and the encouragement or the reinforcement of these unusual ways of practicing agriculture. And so cooperatives have multi-layered purposes for actually developing these systems. Now here in Africa, where we find these scaling up of farmer-managed natural regeneration, for example, or conservation agriculture with trees, we find that local level organizations, not necessarily cooperatives, but land care groups, grassroots organizations, civil society groups, are very, very important and successful in helping farmers to build the knowledge base as well as to manage these systems in areas particularly where livestock grazing has to be controlled in order for trees to be evolving in systems. And in many parts of Africa, you have free grazing has been the traditional way of managing livestock in the dry season. That has to be somewhat curtailed, at least temporarily for a few years, to be able, in any part of an agroecosystem, for trees to be able to revive. It was one of the reasons why people for the longest time never thought that it would be possible in the Sahel for this kind of a transformation to occur, because free grazing is such a ubiquitous practice throughout the Sahel. But through cooperation at the village level, this type of modest control of livestock grazing was enabling to farmers to be able to regenerate trees successfully. And once they're about 5 to 6 feet, a couple of meters tall, they will withstand browsing and they will then take off. But before that, there is in local areas a necessity to keep an eye on livestock grazing in order to make that happen. So that is a cooperative enterprise as well.
Very good. Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for that discussion. We have reached the end of the presentation at 12 o'clock our time. So I think with that, I think we can conclude the presentation. And thank you for all the participants and your questions. And thank you so much, Dennis, for such an excellent presentation and the discussion. Is everyone hearing me? Okay, yeah, sorry. So I'd like to thank you for such an excellent presentation. That does conclude today's webinar. I'll remind participants that today's presentation has been recorded and will be available for future viewing on our website, the agroforestryinaction.org website. And some participants have asked about whether the slides will be available. We'll check with the presenter on that and let everyone know. But let us close. Were you okay? Then we can facilitate sending a PDF of the slides. Okay, then we can facilitate sending. Well, thank you again, Dennis.
Mm-hmm. And thank you again, Greg. And let's continue these dialogues. I would very much like to continue corresponding with members of the audience that are interested in following up. And together we may eventually create an evergreen revolution.
Excellent. I hope we can continue. Dennis, thank you for posting your contact information. So there you see on the screen, participants can contact directly Dennis and through his email and be added to the mailing list, as well as the websites. And this platform is open for future events. So I hope in the future we can schedule events to continue discussion on this topic. Thanks again. Okay. Good. Goodbye to everyone.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you for participating. Bye-bye.
Goodbye to everyone.